Greetings, chess fans. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and I'm going to supplement the old Quick Ruy Lopez series because there aren't enough episodes already covering the Danish or Schliemann, and there won't be enough episodes in this series anyway. I'm kidding. But I do think that it is important to supplement one of the lines in particular that I missed. It's an important line, and it's a very, very interesting and exciting line. So this is going to kind of double as a bit of tactics practice for you guys. So the variation shows up after the following moves. Okay, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Okay, and there's our Danish or Schliemann. d3, which is, we could say, maybe the modern main line. And then, again, with this queen d3, queen c4 stuff. But here, instead of knight to c3, which was the move that we looked at in a fair degree of depth, and it goes into a, most of the time it goes into a queen and two rooks for each side ending, where black should hold without too much difficulty, but white, all right, it's not quite drawn hand, but it's fairly close. But here there's a very, very exciting alternative for white, and black has to play quite accurately. But if black does play very accurately, then white is the one who has to be careful. So the line goes like this. It starts with b4. All right, well, the clear point is that if you retreat the bishop, you just lose. Black or white takes on c6 twice and then takes the rook in the corner. So you have to interpolate the move bishop to e6, which you want to do anyway because it's a nice developing move, but also because, if nothing else, it would allow you to move the king at some point to get out of the check, and the second check on c6, and then the rooks are connected. But anyway, there's much more complication to be worked through here. So bishop c6, bc, and the black pawn on c6 is once again under attack. White's doing this little ring around the rosies thing here. Now you want to be careful. You might think, well, bishop takes b4 is fine because queen c6 check king f7. But no, the problem is queen to b7 with the double attack hitting the rook on a8 and the bishop on b4. So that would be a blunder. So you have to go back to b6. And now a4. So this is the idea. If white isn't going to get that rook after all, well, by golly, he's going to get the bishop. He's going to Noah's Ark it. a5, bishop d4, c3. Now, black could bail out here with knight takes e4, a5, bishop f2 check, rook f2, knight f2. Unfortunately, white throws in queen c6 check, and then takes. And here, white has two knights for rook and a pawn. But black's pawn structure is kind of poor. And generally speaking, I mean, most of the time, the two minor pieces are going to be a little bit better than the rook and pawn, or sometimes even two pawns. And I think that's the case here as well. So this, if it was just this, then white would be in great shape, and everyone should play like this against the Schliemann. But black has a much more interesting and I think stronger approach, has a much stronger approach with castling kingside, calling white's bluff in effect. So daring him, go ahead, trap my bishop. But we'll see that it's not so simple. All right, a5. This is, of course, the way to go. And now what does black do? Oh, I should say, okay, if white does something else, I guess we could think about this. Never seen white do anything else, but I suppose he could. Maybe one idea. No, okay, I was thinking bishop c8 and then queen, and then a5, but there's queen c4 check. Well, that might be a repetition of sorts. Bishop c8, queen c4, bishop b6 might be possible. White might find some way of constructively dealing with that. Also, black is starting to play knight takes e4 here, because this time queen c6 won't come with check, so black will have two pawns and a nice center with his rook for the two minor pieces. So anyway, a5 is the only thing that I think has been played here, as far as I know. And now black can try a couple of things, but bishop to d4 is definitely the move that ought to be recommended, that ought to be played. It's the move I am recommending. But knight to g4 is actually kind of interesting too, with some similar ideas. I just want to show some cool variations here. But we'll see some similar lines in a moment with the correct bishop to d4. But the immediate knight to g4, a takes b6, rook f3, might tempt white into playing something here, for instance, like b7. All right, material is even, but black has a very dangerous attack, while white is threatening lots and lots of rooks, and to make a queen for that matter. How should black respond to this? Well, figure it out. Should he play rook to b8, rook a to f8, something else? what's black to do here? The answer, I think, is queen to h4. This just wins. So you can let him take a rook, make a queen, and we don't bother saving the other rook either. We just play king to f7. What does he do? Well, he can't take the rook because queen h2 is mate. And on h3, we just play rook takes h3, threatening rook to h1 mate. There's no defense to this except to take the rook. And now there's no defense, period. So the threat's queen h2 mate. White only has spite checks with his queens. I mean, he can play queen e8 check, king takes, queen c6, king to d8, and then, okay, queen a8 check, king e7, or king to d7, sorry, not e7, but d7, and that's it. I mean, then it's time for another spite check with the queen. So sooner or later, rook to d1 would have to be played to stop queen h2 mate, and then it's mate in two like this. All right, so back here, b7 is a loser. But knight to d2, I think, is a problem. Now, queen h4, of course, makes no sense because knight takes f3, grabs the rook and stops the mate, and does it with tempo hitting the queen. So black should move one rook or the other to f8, most likely. All right, so let's say rook a to f8. Takes. And here, b takes c7 is good because now on queen h4, h3, rook h3, we queen. Okay, if king f7, then check, and mate. So black doesn't get to deliver his own mate on h1 or h2 or f2. If we take this queen, then this won't work either because this guy comes into the action, and again it's a quick mate. King to g8, queen e8. Looks like mate in two moves. King f6, queen f7. So that's a sad story for black. All right, what about just retreating our rook? After all, material is still even, and now we're threatening queen h4. True, but white still has good resources. For instance, here, queen h4, h3. What now? If you move the rook, he just takes the knight, and there's no real attack. If knight f2, this is at least interesting, then knight f3 is good. Knight h3 check, king h2. And it appears, maybe it's not so, but it looks like black is losing here. If rook f3, then white will take the rook, make a queen, and that should win. Since king f7, rook takes f3 is check. All right, so black's lost there. And after rook a to b8 here, white calmly plays h3, and again I think black is probably busted here. Although material's still even, I mean you can keep your stuff, retreat the knight. But the thing is, white's going to clean up on the queen side. I mean, a7 is going to drop, c6 might drop, and black can try to make threats against the h3 pawn after retreating the knight, but white has rook a3, which will shore up that pawn, and then I don't really think that black can break through over there. So this seems to be inadequate. So it's better, if we're going to sacrifice the piece, to do so without letting the white pawn on a5 turn into a big threat. So bishop to d4 first. And the second important point is that after c3, now the white rook can't go to a3 to help defend either. So that's another benefit. So now we do play knight to g4. Okay, so the following analysis is built off of analysis that it's in Brunello's Attacking the Spanish, and also in Harika Dronovali, her piece in the New in Chess Yearbook 98. But I found a lot of improvements, in fact, over both players' analysis. So you're getting, I think, some good material here, and stuff that's not just a rehash of what's out there, but some new and very important improvements. All right, so here white can consider three moves, two of which lose. One is queen takes c6, and here I think I'm just following what's already known, I think. So rook takes f3. Now, queen a8 check, rook f8 is bad for white. If you play c takes d4, then queen h4, so we've seen this kind of idea already. Yeah, it's important not to play rook f8, because we need the rook for this sacrifice. And we already know how this works out. Black forces mate shortly. Maybe there's some line where white can throw away everything and avoid mate, but I doubt it. All right, g takes f3 would be the alternative. Now queen h4. and there's not going to be any perpetual here. Or it's not just a perpetual, it's going to be mate. Note, by the way, if H3, well, let me show you the main line. So takes here, FG, and this is obviously mating on G2. Now, we're going to see a similar line later where white can play H3 to escape, but here it doesn't work because we have queen to G3 check, taking advantage of the pin, and then queen to H2 mate. So there's no escape there. So queen takes C6 in this position is hopeless. All right. Another line that's been given is queen to E2, and it's claimed by Brunello, and I think Dronovalli repeats the analysis. They claim that this is a draw, but this is not the case. Black is winning here. Rook F3, GF3, knight H2, C takes D4, and then here they both give queen F7, king H2, queen H5, followed by queen G6, queen H5, and so on, with perpetual. But this is a mistake. With queen to H4, I believe it's a win for black. We can just build here. All right, rook A3, rook F8. And black's idea is very, very simple. He's going to lift the rook to F6 and come over to G6, and that'll be that. So D takes E5, stops it for a move, and now queen to D3 with the idea of queen to D8 check. But the column H6 is good enough, and white has no constructive moves here. So about as good as he's got here is queen to D1, which also protects the F3 pawn with the rook instead of with the queen. But now rook F6 here, and there's no defense. I mean, white has to give up the queen for the rook. Of course, he was up a rook already, so that's okay materially. Right now, white has two rooks for a queen and a pawn. But the problem is that black's attack is not over, and the plan is very simple. F5, F4, bishop H3, and this is a nice move. So the problem is if king takes H2, then queen takes F2, check, and mate next move, either on G2 or G3, depending on where the white king goes. But if he doesn't take the knight, well, queen G5 and queen G2 will finish the job. And of course, he didn't have to let the pawn get to F4, but if he does something different, he's just losing differently. So this is all a disaster for white. All right, so queen E2 is losing. Another try, sorry, there are 4 tries total. So queen C6 loses, queen E2 loses. Bishop G5 is probably holding, although, again, white's under some pressure. Queen E8, CD4, rook F3, and now knight H2. Okay, and knight to D2 is probably best. Queen H5. And now, okay, if queen C6, rook F8 is very dangerous for white. On F4, okay, there's an immediate draw to be had with queen G4 check. And then, you know, king H2, queen H3, queen G4, and so on. Or black could also play rook F8 here, and again, speculate and try to push things. So black is in no danger of losing at all. I mean, he can draw, at least for the moment, more or less at will. And the only question is whether that situation will maintain itself. That is, whether white can maintain equality. All right, so bishop to G5 is playable. This I don't see a forced win against, but certainly there's no advantage for white there. All right, so the main move is C takes D4, and now rook takes F3. By the way, I should say back here, yeah, you don't want to play knight takes E4 here, so this is not quite the same thing. And the reason is that after CD4, rook F3, and so on, okay, probably G takes F3 is all right here. But anyway, there's no threat against H2. I mean, you need to have the queen going to H4, so that's why this is not correct. So you would think, you know, it's nice to grab a pawn and so on, but the point is we need to hit H2. So okay, C takes D4, rook F3, and now if G takes F3, well, this is how the stem game went. A game Hossein against Ganguly, played in Nagpur in 2008. And so the game concluded with a nice simple perpetual. So here's where I was saying H3 is right, and this is what happened in the game. If F takes G4, check here, and then bishop H3, splat. So H3 is an important improvement here. In the other line, there was a bishop on D4, so we had queen and G3 check. We don't have it now. So now after queen takes H3, FG4, well, this is the best that black has. And bishop G4 is going to be way too slow. And so just this. and a draw was agreed here. So that's the safe way for white to go. Now, knight to d2 is a very interesting move, though. This was recently played or discovered, however you want to put it, well, certainly both, by Robert Hess. And he played this against Kachian in the, I think it was in the U.S. Championship last year in St. Louis 2010. So in this position, okay, well, the game went like this. So it went rook to c3, h3, knight h6, knight b1, rook c4, takes, d takes e5, and white has some advantage here, and indeed went on to win the game. So it's still a complicated position, but white does seem to be better at this point. But as Dronovalli points out, rightly, instead of, okay, so back to here. After knight to d2, rook c3, h3, the best move is probably knight to f6. All right, I mean, knight h6, I mean, it's kind of funny. So it's sort of the inverse, in a way, of the knight takes e4 versus knight g4 issue I mentioned before. So knight takes e4 looks great. You grab a pawn and all of that, but you need the knight on g4 to have the hit on h2. So here, knight h6 looks like the much more natural move. So we keep the f-file clear. We keep the queen's route to h4 or to g5 clear. But knight f6 is, in fact, right. And the reason for this seems to be that, well, or one way of putting it is that the knight on h6 dead ends. So it's in effect sacrificing its prospects for the remaining, or for two of black's other attackers. But here, okay, it's going to cost a tempo, but once black plays knight to h5, then again the queen has a clear path, again the rook has a clear path, but the knight is then functioning too. So it's worth a tempo to keep the knight as an active and useful unit in the attack here. All right, so now there are, I think, three moves we need to look at. There's queen to b7, there's d takes e5, and there's rook to a3. And rook to a3 is the move the computer initially thinks is fantastic, so let's have a look at this first. So rook a3, bishop a3, knight h5. So there we go. All right, now from here, a couple of lines. So we'll start with d takes e5. And here, Dronovalli suggests rook to f8, and I think her line ended with equality. But here's another big improvement, knight f4. So this, I think, is winning or nearly winning for black. All right, knight f3, stopping queen g5 for starters, rook f8. And now, okay, a couple of interesting lines. Bishop c1 and e takes d6, followed by bishop to c1. And this interpolated exchange is not good for white. So takes, bishop c1, and here black has knight takes g2, which is even better than taking on h3. So king g2, bishop h3, king h3, rook f3, king g2, queen takes e4, and white is well on the way to being roadkill. So this is completely winning for black. All right, so that's what happens on ed, bishop c1. Knight takes g2 wins. On the immediate bishop to c1, however, knight takes g2 does not win. It's a mistake, because after king g2, bishop h3, here, our queen can't magically jump over the e5 pawn to take on e4. So that's the difference. And in this position, white is winning. So you've got to be careful sometimes to these little details. They can make a big difference. So the right move for black in this case is knight takes h3 check. Takes, rook takes, queen c6, bishop h3. And clearly, black has the upper hand here. I mean, material is even, but white's king is very, very lonely, and the light squares are terribly weak. So ed, cd, e5, really the only move here. And now, rook f8. Okay, and here, white still has to play very accurately. For instance, if he plays e takes d6, then queen e6 wins. There's no decent defense to queen to g4 check, or queen g6 check, and it's not only a mating threat, well, it's not a mating threat at all, actually, because for the moment at least, the queen on c6 covers g2. But there is a threat, obviously, to the rook on f1. And there are threats to play things like after queen g6 check, king over, bishop to g4, followed by bishop f3. So the attack continues and between the weakness of the king and the rook. Actually, the rook has nowhere to go, because if it goes to d1, queen g4 check, and then queen takes d1. So white is completely lost here. Queen d5 check then, king h8, and now again e takes d6 is bad because of queen to e2. Again, the rook, the hapless rook, is going to be put out of business here. All right, bishop. Oh, queen takes d6 is also bad for white. Not as bad, but black has excellent winning chances. I mean, after bishop to f4, you play a6, and thanks to the outside passed h pawn, the white king really can't go on any big journeys to the queen side. And I think black should win this probably in the long run. All right, so the only move here that's good for white seems to be bishop to e3. All right, now queen to e8, again aiming at g6, rook c1, and so there's the difference. So now, thanks to bishop to e3, the rook has enough room to get away from the threats. Still, black is much better here, aiming to reroute this bishop to f3, for instance, bishop g4 check, bishop f3. But it's, well, okay, first there's the discovery threat as well on e6, so this threatens mate, so rook e8. And I would just say the chronic weakness of the light squares on the king side still spells big trouble for white, but maybe it's not 100% lost, but it's close. So back here, d takes e5 is not a good move. Let's give it a question mark. All right. Whoops. So knight f3. Let's try this one instead. So on this, I think, here I improved on Dronavali's analysis, this time for white. So rook to f8, bishop c1, rook f3, gf3, bishop h3. And it looks pretty bad for white here. And indeed, her line goes queen takes c6, queen e6, threatening queen g6, queen a8 check, bishop g5. Now knight f4, takes, and then queen d5. But this pawn ending should be winning for black. And I concur. I mean, I think it's a good piece of analysis. However, instead of queen takes c6, it looks like queen c4 check first. Well, okay, I'm not taking on c6 here, but queen c4, now d takes e5. And it seems that probably white can survive. I mean, it's key to keep the rook on f1 protected, so you have time to play king h2. And in this position, all right, black can still try. I mean, he is up a pawn, but with as many queenside weaknesses as black has, and with the only passer being the h-pawn, it looks like white should hold this, and in fact hold it fairly comfortably. Maybe there's a neat idea for black that will change the evaluation, but it looks like it's equal. All right, so rook a3 is not a loser, if my improvement on her analysis is correct there, but it's not great either. Okay, next try, d takes e5. de, rook b1, knight h5, and okay, here if bishop to b2, black just wins pretty comfortably. Bishop c8, driving the queen to e2, and then we get knight f4 with tempo, and then we have rook takes h3, which I think is even better than Dronavali's knight takes g2, but probably everything wins there. Any normal move, I think, wins for black. So knight f3 is forced here, and okay, here after bishop takes h3, the computer will initially suggest two moves. So one of them is bishop to e3, but this just loses to bishop takes g2 and then queen e6. All right, try number two is queen to e2, and then bishop to g4. And here Dronavali's analysis stops, and she claims that black is clearly better. And it sure looks like black is clearly better. I mean, the position looks just awful for white. I mean, and black's even up a pawn. It's not a great pawn, but hey, better than being down. And you know, this pin looks strong, and black's pieces are much more active than white's. How could this be wrong? Well, I don't know, but it seems to be. So the computer insists that it's equal, and I tried some variations, and it still says that it's equal. So I don't know. Maybe there's something good here. But bishop to e3 is sensible, stopping any rook takes f3 tricks. And now, for instance, if you play rook to f8, well, this would be great, except for queen a2 check, and then knight h2. And white's okay here. So bishop takes f3, queen f3, knight f4, and now rook f to c1. and white's going to get pressure on the c file against these weak pawns. Takes, queen b4, and all right, after e5, another nice little move. Okay, at the moment, black is up 3 pawns. All right, that's not going to stay that way. Queen takes c6, and the c7 pawn is loose. The rook, of course, is hanging on a8. There's also the idea of queen c4 check and queen f4. Rook e8, sorry, of course, just hangs the rook, but rook c8 is what I mean, and then queen e6 check, and the rook drops. So it looks like white is fine here. In fact, maybe black has to be a little bit accurate to maintain the balance. I don't think he has to be that accurate, but the basic idea is that white seems to be fine. So black is certainly in no trouble in this line, but isn't better either. Okay, finally queen to b7. All right, on this, rook f8, d takes e5, and now another improvement over Dronovalli, this time for black. So she gives d takes e5 with an eventual perpetual check. But we don't need the pawn. Knight h5. Let's just go. Get on with the attack. Knight f3. Bishop takes h3, of course. Knight e1. Queen takes e5. And black is happy here. For instance, bishop to d2, and now a nice, very nice move. Knight to g3. With the idea of knight to e2 check, retreating the bishop and then playing, well, like knight e2, let's say king h1, and then maybe bishop c8 followed by queen h5 mate. Okay, that would be one sample idea. So f takes g3, queen d4, rook takes f1, bishop c3, and it doesn't seem that white, I mean, it seems like there should be a forced mate with queen g1 maybe, but the king is going to be safe enough on g4 apparently. So queen c3, rook b1, h5, and black is much better here, close to winning, but maybe not quite. It's not quite resigns time for white, but it's certainly bad for him. So it looks like rook takes a3 was equalizing, d takes e5 is equalizing, and queen takes b7 maybe close to a loss here. So, all right. All very interesting. As I said, there's lots of improvements over the existing theory, and perhaps you guys will find some improvements on mine, on what I came up with as well. If you do, I hope you'll share. At any rate, this was, I think, an important gap that needed to be closed. So, ignoring this b4 line, because it's, again, I mean, if black doesn't play accurately right away, he can just get killed, and the lines are very fascinating, as I think you'll agree. All right, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.